Hey, storyteller. Conflict is the essence of narrative writing. Without it, you have no story. This is true whether you're writing fiction, memoir, or other types of narrative nonfiction. But what if you're not writing about epic battles or fights for survival or dysfunctional family drama? There are many types and sources of conflict. Welcome to this week's writer coaching session, where we'll discuss why conflict is so important and all the varieties you can include to make your story an actual story, and keep readers turning pages. Hi, I'm Bridget from B Squared Writer Coaching. I'm an author, editor, and your story coach, here to help you make your story powerful, polished, and publishable, so you can move readers and help them experience your character's adventure with maximum emotional impact. First, I have a gift for you just for visiting my channel. My free workshop, 6 Essential Elements of a Powerful Story. Conflict is just one of the elements that helps you keep readers turning pages. This 25-minute video workshop is packed with tips on how to not only ramp up the conflict in your story, but the characters, plot, setting, and theme. Plus, how to write all this in a way that makes the reader feel like he or she is living the adventure with the characters. Just click the link in the description or visit b2writercoaching.com/workshop. That's the letter B, the number 2, writercoaching.com/workshop to access it today. And be sure to stick around to the end of this video so you won't miss this week's Power Up, a super practical action step you can take right now in the story you're working on. So why is conflict so important to our stories? Well, conflict includes the obstacles, confrontations, and complications that force our characters to grow, change, and take action. And keep in mind, every story is about change in some form or on some level. Let's take a look at the various sources for conflict. The first one that comes to mind is probably an actual antagonist. Though this often villainous character is the source of conflict in many stories, there are numerous other sources of conflict we can use. The most common form conflict can take is character versus character or character versus a group of characters. This is the form in play when we think of an antagonist or villain in the story. This can include stories like The Hobbit, Star Wars, any superhero story, police stories, often detective stories, competition stories, etc. Another form of conflict involves a character versus society. This can include outcast stories or tales of a character trying to overcome some kind of societal injustice like racism, class division, etc. Some notable examples include Romeo and Juliet, Hidden Figures, The Maze Runner, The City of Ember, the Divergent series, The Outsiders, and even to a certain extent, the movie Grease. My novel Keeper of Shadows also has elements of this.
Hey, it's future me jumping in during the editing process to add a source of conflict I skipped in the list. Character versus the self. This is an internal conflict that causes a character to wrestle with what he wants versus what he needs or what he has to do. In a character versus self story, the protagonist may also fight to overcome or to maintain certain flaws, misbeliefs, obsessions, tendencies to make poor choices, or the ramifications of past mistakes. Some examples of the character versus self story can include The Grinch, Pinocchio, Inside Out, and such classics as The Great Gatsby and The Catcher in the Rye.
Another source of conflict is character versus nature. These stories are usually what we think of as natural disaster stories like Twister, Volcano, The Perfect Storm, and many others. One form of conflict, a bit similar to the last one, is character versus the setting or environment. This wouldn't be a natural disaster, but it can also fall into a character versus nature type conflict because it can involve a character who is trying to climb a mountain in stories like Cliffhanger and stories of characters trying to cross a desert or sailing a particularly dangerous section of ocean. They can also include stories of characters battling a man-made setting, such as the arena in The Hunger Games or The Matrix. Similar to the character versus society conflict, we also have the character versus an ideology. In these stories, it's not just really the society itself the character is trying to change, but a particular idea held by certain groups in the society. It may not be the society as a whole. In stories like Divergent, the entire society is dystopian and the class system involved is comprehensive for the entire group of people. But in stories where a character is battling battling an ideology, certain segments of that society may uphold that ideology, not the society as a whole. For instance, characters may battle racism. I mentioned hidden figures earlier in the character versus society section. It could have also fit here, but society as a whole at that time was largely embroiled in racism. Not everyone, of course, held to that ideology, but it was more of a systemic issue during that era. Keep in mind, even though the character is really battling the idea of racism or prejudice or whatever the idea is, the story is usually more powerful if that idea is embodied in a particular character who believes in it. So this character may be the antagonist of the story, and the protagonist either needs to defeat this person in some way or change his or her mind on the ideology. An often overlooked source of conflict is character versus destiny. These stories are about characters who are trying to overcome a predestined path that was set forth for that person either by a particular person or society or even a prophecy. It basically boils down to a conflict between free will and fate. A popular example of this would be the Harry Potter series, in which Harry finds out that he is the subject of a prophecy and was foretold to be the only one who could face and potentially defeat the antagonist, Voldemort. But it's really unclear whether the prophecy means that he will defeat Voldemort or they'll just kill each other or he would die in the attempt. He, in some ways, fights against this destiny in being the chosen one. He just wants a regular life, to be a regular person and accepted for who he is. But he ultimately does realize he has to do this. So it's not that he ever really shies away from confronting Voldemort. His issue is more of fighting the idea that this is fated and he can't do anything about it. Other examples of this can be characters who are subjected to an arranged marriage or live in a society where your career is chosen for you, or even a character who's balking at the career choices his family might be making for him, as opposed to what his preference is. These types of stories can also include any time travel stories in which the character is trying to change the past in order to affect his or her future in a more positive way. And finally, we have character versus the supernatural. These are stories where a character is facing a spiritual struggle. This may be the character wrestling with his or her relationship with God or a response to a religion or some kind of faith. Maybe the character grew up in that religion and is struggling with whether this is really how he or she believes or the type of religion or faith he or she wants to continue with. This can also include the character battling supernatural forces. This can be angels, demons, ghosts, figures from mythology, etc. Are you finding this helpful so far? If so, consider clicking the like button so YouTube will show this video to more writers like you. Now that we've discussed the sources of conflict, let's look at the types of conflict. There are two main types of conflict we can use: external and internal. When we think of conflict, most of the time people are thinking of the external conflict. This is what the main plot of the story most often centers around. As the name suggests, external conflict refers to complications, obstacles, and confrontations that exist outside the protagonist. These are the obvious things the character must fight against or battle. When we're thinking of the action of the story, we usually mean the external conflict. Sources of external conflict can include bad luck, natural disasters, physical trauma or illness, other characters, groups, beings, creatures, even accidents and supernatural forces. What are internal conflicts? This is a conflict between opposing forces within the character, within his or her thoughts, emotions, etc. One of the most common types of internal conflict is the dilemma. This is a difficult or seemingly impossible choice the character must make. This isn't a choice the character can shirk off. He or she has to make a decision, or in some cases, not making a decision is a choice as well. Dilemmas can take two forms: a best bad choice or a decision between two irreconcilable good choices. In a best bad choice, neither option is good for the protagonist or for those he or she cares about, but a choice must be made. The character can't get out of it. In irreconcilable good choices, as the name suggests, we have two options that could be good. Maybe one's good for the protagonist, the other is good for the people the protagonist cares about. You can't have both, you have to pick one. So are you going to choose to help yourself, or are you going to choose to help the world or society or the people you love? Other types of internal conflicts can be created by mistakes the character made. Let's say the character messed up and is feeling guilt over it. That guilt causes a great deal of internal conflict. Maybe shame, embarrassment, lots of other emotions can stem from a mistake the character made. Whether that mistake was due to ineptitude or a bad choice, or the character just misunderstood something and that created the mistake. So whether it's the character's actual fault or not, you can show a real struggle going on within the character's mind and emotions over something like this. Guilt can be quite damaging to a character, and it can be something a character carries throughout life and makes a great foundation for transformation in a character arc. If you're not sure what a character arc is and how to create one, check out this video linked above, and I'll also link it in the description. Internal conflict can also stem from the lies a character believes about himself or herself, or about other groups of people or society. These can be caused by past experiences. Often this can involve low self-esteem. If a character believes lies about himself and thinks he's not worth anything or isn't good enough, that can also stem from past treatment by others or past failures. Lies the character believes about someone else could create interpersonal conflict as well. I'm thinking of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Elizabeth Bennet believes Wickham's lies about Mr. Darcy, and that creates conflict between her and him that threatens to sabotage her entire future. So you see, one type of conflict can lead to another, in this case internal conflict leading to external conflict, or they can be intertwined. The character may also be unwilling to accept the evidence that's right before his or her eyes. This can be an internal conflict, something the character is wrestling with, but that can also create external conflict between the character and others in the story. This person's ignoring what's right in front of him, and other characters can see clearly what's going on. So that's a great opportunity for interpersonal conflict as well. And finally, internal trauma, fear, and doubt can also create great internal conflict. And now I have a bonus conflict type for you, a combination of internal and external conflict. Yes, they can be woven together, and one event or one situation in the story can create both internal and external conflict. I've already mentioned how internal conflict can escalate and become external conflict. The reverse can also be true. An external conflict can create internal conflict. For example, an external conflict may be a character suffers from an illness or some kind of accident or physical trauma. That can create internal conflict in the form of fear, self-doubt, frustration, feelings of guilt, because this character can't do the things he or she normally would do. So maybe this character can't take care of his family because he's been in this accident. In Keeper of Shadows, my main character, Lisanne, falls under a curse which takes the form of a physical illness, and she can't perform her duties in the village anymore. And that really leads to everything else that happens in the story. But one of the things she battles is the internal conflict of feeling like she's not useful, and in her society being useful is essential. So she has to come to terms with the fact that a person's worth is not defined by what they do, but by how they live. And that's basically the theme of the entire book. So which type of conflict do you include in your story? Internal, external, both? My suggestion would be to use both. Most stories do need both because the internal conflict is the essence of the character arc. Combining internal and external conflict is one powerful way to ramp up our stories. Speaking of that, if you haven't done so yet, be sure to grab your link to my free workshop, 6 Essential Elements of a Powerful Story. Remember, just click the link in the description or visit b2writercoaching.com/workshop. For this week's Power Up, examine the story you're working on, whether you have plotted it or you've already started writing or you've got most of it or all of it finished, and make sure you've included an external conflict to assist with the pacing and action of the story, and an internal conflict to help with developing your protagonist's character arc. And try adding another source of conflict besides character versus another character to give your story depth and variety. This can be just on a scene-by-scene basis, so you may choose a particular scene in the story in which you're going to have a conflict besides that between your main character and your antagonist. For instance, you might give your protagonist a dilemma in a particular scene, or show that person battling some some element of nature in a particular situation. It's good to have a variety of types of conflict throughout your story. Even though you'll have one main source of conflict, we can use many of these in small doses throughout the story to keep readers from becoming bored and give our story a few twists. And keep in mind that conflict needs to be present in not just your story as a whole, but each scene should have some type of conflict. However, there are also specific points of conflict that every story needs to include. These are called story beats. To find out what these are, check out this video, and let's power up your storytelling.